November 1972, Tel Aviv, Israel. The Supreme Court of the State of Israel has just issued its ruling. The decision is unanimous. Meyer Lansky's application for citizenship under the law of return is denied. He is ordered to leave the country within 30 days. Meyer Lansky is 70 years old. He has been in Israel for 14 months, living quietly in a Tel Aviv apartment, walking in the mornings, eating at local restaurants, attending synagogue on Shabbat, living the life of a Jewish grandfather in the Jewish homeland. He has been, by every account from the people who encountered him during this period, a man who had found something he had been looking for his entire life. A place where he was simply Jewish, not Jewish in the hyphenated immigrant sense of Jewish American, not Jewish as a qualifier attached to his professional identity, but simply Jewish in the way that everyone around him was simply Jewish. At home, in a way he had never quite been anywhere else. The Supreme Court has just told him to leave. The specific grounds for the denial are that Meyer Lansky is likely to endanger public safety. The law of return, which grants every Jewish person the right to immigrate to Israel, contains a provision excluding those who are likely to act in a manner that threatens public order or state security. The Israeli government, under substantial pressure from the United States government, which had made its position on Meyer Lansky's potential citizenship very clear through diplomatic channels, had invoked this provision. The Supreme Court had upheld the invocation. The man who had given more money to Jewish causes than almost any private individual of his generation, who had organized physical resistance to American Nazi groups in the 1930s, who had contributed to the Israeli independence effort, who considered himself Jewish before he considered himself anything else, was being told by the Jewish state that he was not the kind of Jew it wanted. This story has almost everything. The specific irony of a man rejected by the community he had spent his life defending, the pressure of a superpower on a small country to refuse one of its own citizens, the specific pain of a man who had built an empire on invisibility, finally trying at 70 years old to be visible in the one place where he believed his visibility would be accepted. And the question, which has never been fully answered, of whether the decision was about law or about politics, about what Meyer Lansky actually was, or about what America needed Israel to say he was. To understand the Israel story, you have to understand what being Jewish meant to Meyer Lansky. Not in the abstract, not as a cultural heritage or religious practice or a dietary preference, but as the specific weight it carried in the specific life he lived. He was born in 1902 in a Jewish community in what is now Belarus. He arrived at Ellis Island at 9 years old in 1911, speaking no English, carrying the specific vulnerability of a Jewish immigrant child in a city that did not particularly want Jewish immigrants and was not particularly careful about what happened to them. He grew up in the Lower East Side in a community where being Jewish was not a matter of identity, it was a matter of survival, where the specific threats that Jewish communities had faced in Europe had followed the immigrants across the ocean in modified forms, where anti-Semitism was not a distant historical phenomenon, but an ambient feature of daily life. He organized street resistance to American Nazi groups in the 1930s. This is documented fact, not mythology. The German-American Bund, the American Nazi organization that held rallies in Madison Square Garden and marched in New York neighborhoods with swastika armbands, was a genuine threat to Jewish communities, and the organized physical resistance to those rallies that Meyer Lansky helped lead was a real intervention in a real situation. He said later, in one of the few direct statements he ever made about his motivations, that he would have done it without being asked, that some things did not require calculation, that when someone is trying to destroy your people, you stop them, whatever that requires. He contributed to Israeli causes throughout his career, contributions that were substantial enough to be noticed and documented. Before Israeli independence in 1948, when the effort to establish a Jewish state in Palestine was still an underground movement fighting British mandatory authority, Meyer Lansky was among the American donors who funded the weapons purchases and the operational costs of that effort. He gave money that helped buy the equipment that helped win the war that established the state. He was not the only American donor. He was one of the most consistent and least publicized. After 1948, he continued to contribute to Israeli bonds, to specific institutions, to causes that were connected to the Israeli state in ways that were documented enough to demonstrate a sustained commitment over decades. The exact amounts are not fully public because Meyer Lansky did not publicize his charitable activities any more than he publicized anything else about himself. But the pattern is documented well enough to establish that his relationship to the Israeli state was not a sudden or cynical one. It was a relationship built over decades of consistent financial support, motivated by something that the financial support was a way of expressing. In 1970, facing increasing legal pressure in the United States and the specific possibility of a Las Vegas skimming prosecution that his lawyers told him was serious, Meyer Lansky began seriously considering making use of the law of return. The law of return is one of the foundational pieces of Israeli legislation, passed in 1950, establishing the right of every Jewish person in the world to immigrate to Israel and become a citizen. It was passed in response to the Holocaust as a statement that the Jewish state would be the refuge for Jewish people facing persecution anywhere in the world. It was meant to be unconditional in its essential premise. Every Jew had the right to come home. Meyer Lansky was Jewish. He had contributed to Israel for decades. He had a deep and documented connection to the Jewish community, and the law of return said he had the right to come. In July 1970, he flew to Tel Aviv. He did not announce it as a dramatic move. He simply arrived, applied for citizenship under the law of return, and settled in to wait for the application to be processed. The American reaction was immediate. The Nixon administration, which had its own complicated relationship with organized crime investigations and with the specific question of Meyer Lansky, communicated through diplomatic channels to the Israeli government that his presence in Israel was not welcome from the American perspective. The specific content of those communications has never been fully declassified, but the general thrust is documented in the subsequent Israeli government response. America was making clear that granting Meyer Lansky citizenship would be a problem in the bilateral relationship between the two countries. Israel understood. The Israeli government began the legal process of challenging his citizenship application. The case went to the Israeli Supreme Court. Meyer Lansky's lawyers argued that the law of return was unconditional in its application to Jewish people, that the public safety exception was narrow and required specific documented evidence of a current threat rather than a general reputation, and that their clients' charitable contributions and personal history of support for Israel demonstrated exactly the kind of connection to the Jewish community that the law of return was designed to honor. The government argued that the public safety exception applied, that his documented criminal associations made him a genuine threat to public order, and that international relations considerations were relevant to the court's assessment. The court ruled against him. 7 judges. The decision was unanimous on the conclusion, if not on the reasoning. The public safety exception applied. The application was denied. He had 30 days to leave. The specific pain of the Israeli rejection is something that Meyer Lansky never spoke about publicly in the direct terms that would have made the wound fully visible. He did not give press conferences on the steps of the Supreme Court. He did not write an open letter or make a statement that named what the decision meant to him. He said, in the measured terms he applied to everything, that he was disappointed and that he would comply with the court's decision. Then he left. But the people who were close to him during this period described something that the public composure did not fully contain. His wife Anne, who was with him in Israel throughout the 14 months, described in later interviews a man who had been, in Israel, more peaceful and more present and more himself than at any other time in their years together, who had found in Tel Aviv something that the decades of operational life in America had never provided, who had let his guard down in a way that she had rarely seen. And when the court decision came, the withdrawal of that peace happened visibly in the days after the ruling, in a way that was different from any other setback she had seen him absorb. His daughter-in-law, in a separate account, described visiting him in the days after the decision and finding him sitting by the window of the Tel Aviv apartment, looking out at the city in a way that was different from his usual quality of attention. Not calculating, not processing, just looking. She said she had never seen him look at anything that way before, and never saw him look at anything that way again after he returned to Miami. The contrast between what Israel represented and what it did to him is the sharpest irony in a life full of irony. Meyer Lansky had spent 50 years being invisible because invisibility was protective. In Israel, he had tried, for the first time in his adult life, to be visible as what he most fundamentally was. Not as a financial architect, or a syndicate associate, or an FBI target, or a fugitive from an American prosecution, just as a Jewish man who had come home. And the Jewish state had looked at what he most fundamentally was and said, no, not you, not this kind of Jew. The decision to refuse him was made, in significant part, because of American diplomatic pressure. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is the conclusion supported by the documentary evidence of the period and by subsequent accounts from Israeli officials who have described the bilateral pressure that preceded the Supreme Court ruling. The American government wanted Meyer Lansky back in American jurisdiction, where the prosecution that had pushed him to leave could be pursued. The Israeli government needed American support for reasons that were existential rather than marginal. The calculation was not a difficult one. Meyer Lansky's citizenship application was traded for something more important to Israel's survival than one elderly Jewish man's desire to come home. He understood this. He did not say it in public, but he understood it. The specific quality of his composure in the aftermath of the ruling was the composure not of a man who had been surprised, but of a man who had run the numbers and found the outcome to be what the numbers predicted. He had built his entire life on understanding systems and on navigating them with precision. He understood the system that had produced the Israeli ruling. He understood what the American pressure meant and what it required, and why Israel had complied. He understood that he was, in this specific situation, the expendable variable in a calculation between larger forces. He understood all of this. He was still a man who had just been told by his people that he did not belong. He returned to Miami Beach. He was 70 years old. The Las Vegas prosecution that had pushed him toward Israel eventually collapsed. He was never convicted of the charges that had been the proximate cause of his flight. He lived another 11 years, dying in January 1983, still in the modest Miami Beach apartment, still eating at his regular restaurant, still walking his dog, still reading. He never returned to Israel. In his final years, the subject of Israel came up in the rare interviews he gave. He answered questions about it with the same measured care he applied to every sensitive subject. He said that he had always supported Israel and continued to support it. He did not say that it had broken something in him. He did not say that the rejection had been the most personal wound of his professional life, more personal even than the Bugsy Siegel decision, because that wound was one he had chosen, and this one had been chosen for him. He did not say any of the things that were visible in the accounts of people who had been close to him in the period after the ruling. He said that Israel was the Jewish homeland and that he respected its institutions. Then he changed the subject. This is the final dimension of the Israel story that makes it more than a political episode. It is the story of a man who had built an entire professional existence on the principle that identity was a liability, that being Jewish in America in his time meant being vulnerable in ways that he could not afford, that the safest position was the one with no visible identity at all, and who had found, at 70 years old, that the identity he had suppressed and protected and carried quietly his entire life was the one thing he wanted to be seen as, not as the financial architect, not as the invisible man behind the Syndicate, just as Jewish, just as belonging somewhere because of what he fundamentally was. And the place that should have been the unconditional home for what he was had told him he was the wrong kind of what he was. The law of return had a clause. The clause applied to him. He had 30 days. He left. He spent his last decade in Miami Beach, the man the Jewish state had rejected, continuing to contribute to Jewish causes, continuing to attend synagogue, continuing to be, in every private dimension of his life, exactly what he had always been. A Jewish man from the Lower East Side who had built an empire and lost a homeland on the same day. The specific weight of the Israel rejection is something that the public record can only partially document, and that the people who knew him most closely describe in terms that make clear how much it cost. The invisible man who had tried to be visible in the one place where visibility should have been safe, and had discovered that even there, the calculation went against him. Meyer Lansky died as he had lived, in Miami, in his own bed, surrounded by his family, far from the city he had walked in every morning for 14 months, looking out at the Mediterranean, thinking that he had finally come home. If this story of the most painful irony in a life built on irony, of the man the Jewish state rejected and what that rejection cost him, moved you, subscribe to this channel, because the full story of Meyer Lansky is not only about power and money and survival. It is about what it costs to be who you are in a world that will not let you be it openly. Drop a comment. Tell me what you think about the Israeli Supreme Court's decision. Was it law, or was it politics? And remember this: the hardest rejections are not the ones that come from enemies. They are the ones that come from the place you believed was home. There is a layer to the Israel story that most accounts leave unexplored. It is the layer of what the 14 months in Tel Aviv actually looked like from the inside, before the Supreme Court ruling ended it. Because those 14 months represent something unprecedented in Meyer Lansky's life. They represent a period when the man who had been invisible by design tried to be ordinary by desire, tried to be a person who went to synagogue on Saturday morning and ate hummus at a neighborhood restaurant, and argued about Israeli politics with his neighbors, and walked through a city where his face was not recognized, and his name meant nothing to the people who passed him on the street. This is what he had never had in America. In America, Meyer Lansky's name was always meaningful to someone, to the FBI agents who had been watching him for years, to the organized crime investigators who had studied his financial architecture, to the journalists who knew what he represented, to the syndicate associates who understood what he could do. Even in the apparent anonymity of his Miami Beach routine, he was never truly anonymous. He was the invisible man, which is a specific kind of identity, a specific relationship to visibility that requires constant maintenance and constant awareness. The invisibility was not natural. It was constructed and maintained at cost. In Tel Aviv, in those 14 months, the invisibility was natural because the name meant nothing to most of the people around him. He was an elderly American Jewish man who had come to live in Israel. There were many such men. He spoke enough Hebrew to manage basic conversations. He attended a local synagogue where he was welcomed as a new member of the congregation without particular curiosity about his history. He was, for those 14 months, simply one among many, not invisible by effort, but anonymous by circumstance. The difference between those two things is the difference between a prison and a vacation. The people who encountered him in Israel during this period, neighbors and restaurant owners and synagogue members, and the few journalists who found him and persuaded him to talk briefly, describe a man who was quieter and more open than the figure who appeared in American organized crime investigations, who spoke about Jewish history with genuine knowledge and genuine feeling, who talked about the significance of Israel as a Jewish homeland in terms that were clearly personal rather than rhetorical, who seemed, in the specific way that people seem when they have put down a heavy thing they have been carrying for a long time, lighter. His wife, Anne, who was with him throughout, later described the Israel period as the time when she saw her husband most completely, most fully himself. She said that in America, even in the most private and domestic moments, there was always a quality of alertness, of the professional antenna never fully switching off, of the man who had spent 50 years operating in an environment where inattention was costly. In Israel, that quality was absent, or present in a diminished form. He was, she said, simply there, simply the person he was, without the overlay of everything else. This is what the Supreme Court's ruling took from him. Not a legal status, not a passport, not even a physical location, because he was always going to return to Miami eventually. It took the experience of being simply who he was in a place where that was enough. The 70-year-old man who had spent his entire adult life as something else, something more complicated and more carefully managed, had found a place where he could be simply Jewish, and simply old, and simply present, and had been told he could not stay. The American diplomatic pressure that contributed to the ruling is worth examining more closely, because it illuminates a dynamic that is deeply uncomfortable for anyone who wants to believe that the Israeli government's decision was made purely on the legal merits. The Nixon administration in 1970 was dealing with its own complicated relationship with the organized crime investigations of the Kennedy era, with the specific legal proceedings that were pursuing Meyer Lansky, and with the general political calculation of what happened if he successfully established Israeli citizenship and became effectively unreachable by American prosecutors. The American position was simple. Meyer Lansky should not be in Israel. His presence there was inconvenient for ongoing American legal proceedings, and potentially embarrassing in ways that the administration preferred to avoid. The appropriate channel for communicating this position was diplomatic, and the diplomatic channel was used. The specific content of those communications is still partially classified, but the Israeli government's subsequent action, the speed with which the public safety exception was invoked, the unanimity of the Supreme Court ruling, the specific language of the decision, all of these suggest that the legal case being made was supported by a political calculation that went beyond the purely legal. Israel in 1970 was not in a position to ignore American diplomatic signals. The country was 8 months past the 1967 war. The political and military situation was fragile. American support, in the form of weapons and diplomatic backing and economic assistance, was existential rather than merely helpful. A government that needed American support as much as Israel did in 1970 could not afford to make an issue of an American diplomatic request, however inconvenient the request was in terms of its own legal traditions. The law of return said every Jew had the right to come home. American diplomacy said this particular Jew was inconvenient. The Supreme Court found a legal mechanism for giving American diplomacy what it needed. Meyer Lansky knew this analysis was accurate, or something very close to it. He was not a man who misread systems. He understood, without needing to be told, the calculation that had been made. He was the expendable variable. The bilateral relationship was more important than his application. He had run this kind of calculation himself, in other contexts, many times. He knew what it felt like from the other side of the table. He accepted the result with the same equanimity he brought to every unwelcome outcome that was beyond his control. He left. He went back to Miami. He went back to being what he had always been, the man who did not belong anywhere except where he was. But there is something that the equanimity did not entirely cover, that shows in the accounts of people who saw him in the weeks and months after his return to Miami from Israel. A quality of diminishment that was different from anything that had come before. Not depression in the clinical sense, not bitterness, because bitterness requires a belief that things should have been otherwise, and Meyer Lansky was not a man who invested heavily in the belief that things should have been otherwise. Something subtler and more permanent. The specific diminishment of a man who tried, once, to be simply himself in the world, and was told that even that was not available to him. He was 70 years old when he came back from Israel. He had been building and managing and protecting an invisible empire for 50 years. He had survived everything. Every investigation, every prosecution attempt, every internal syndicate drama, every external threat, every change in the political and legal landscape. He had survived the death of Bugsy Siegel, and the fall of the Cuban Empire, and the Kefauver hearings, and the Kennedy Justice Department, and the Las Vegas investigations, and every other thing that the world had brought to bear against him. He had survived all of it intact. He had not survived Israel. Not in the way that leaving a place intact usually means. He left Israel physically intact, legally intact, financially intact. But something that was not physical or legal or financial had been present in those 14 months in Tel Aviv and was absent from the remaining 11 years in Miami Beach. Anne Lansky described it, in her most precise account, as a quality of hope that was there in Israel and was not there after. She used that specific word, hope. She said she had not known until she saw it in Israel that it had been missing before, and she had not known until it was gone again how much it had mattered. The Israel rejection is, in the fullest telling, the story of the only thing that Meyer Lansky ever wanted that he could not build, manage, protect, or finance into existence. He wanted to belong, to be seen as what he was, to be home in the way that the word means something beyond a physical location. He had the money to go anywhere in the world. He had the intelligence to build almost anything he could imagine. He had survived everything the world had thrown at him for 7 decades. And he could not build or buy or survive his way into the thing he wanted most, which was simply to be Meyer Lansky, Jewish man, at home, among his people, in a place that had said it was unconditionally open to him, and then found a condition. He died in Miami Beach in January 1983. He is buried in Miami, not in Jerusalem. Not in Tel Aviv, where he walked every morning for 14 months and felt, according to the people who saw him there, something that looked from the outside like peace. The law of return still exists. It still says that every Jewish person has the right to come home. Meyer Lansky had that right. He tried to use it. The right was taken from him by a legal mechanism in the service of a political calculation. The specific irony of his life, the man who built an invisible empire and could never be what he was in public, found its sharpest expression in the 14 months in Israel and the ruling that ended them. The home that said, "Come," and then said, "Not you." Consider the specific people who were present in the courtroom when the Israeli Supreme Court issued its ruling and what each of them represented. The 7 justices who wrote the unanimous decision, the government lawyers who had made the case for invoking the public safety exception, Meyer Lansky's Israeli lawyers, who had argued for the plain meaning of the law of return, and Meyer Lansky himself, who had sat in that courtroom with the specific composure of a man who has been in adversarial legal proceedings before and who knows how to receive a verdict without visible collapse. Each of these people was operating within a system. The justices within the system of Israeli law, the government lawyers within the system of Israeli government policy and diplomatic obligation, the defense lawyers within the system of their clients' legal rights, and Meyer Lansky within the system he had always operated in, which was the system of how things actually work underneath the systems that are visible. He understood, sitting in that courtroom, what the visible system was doing and why. And he understood the invisible system that had produced the visible system's action. He was perhaps the only person in that room who fully understood both levels simultaneously. This double understanding, the understanding of the legal proceeding and the understanding of the diplomatic reality that had determined the legal proceeding's outcome, was both his most distinctive quality and, in this specific situation, his greatest burden. Most people who receive an adverse legal ruling experience it as a purely legal event. They may suspect other forces are at work, but they do not know. Meyer Lansky knew. He knew with the precision of a man who had spent 50 years understanding how systems operate underneath their visible surfaces. He knew that the legal ruling was the surface and that the diplomatic calculation was the substance. He knew what the calculation had been and who had made it and why. He knew exactly what he was and what had been done with that knowledge. Sitting in that courtroom, receiving that ruling, he was not the ordinary petitioner experiencing the law's authority. He was the man who understood the machinery behind the law's authority, who could see the specific gears that had produced this specific outcome, who knew the name of the American diplomat who had made the call, and the Israeli official who had received it, and the approximate content of the conversation between them. He understood it all. And understanding it did not make it less painful. It made it more painful, because it stripped away the comfort of believing that the system had failed him by accident or through misapplication of its own rules. The system had not failed him. The system had worked exactly as designed. He had simply been on the wrong end of the design. This is, in the end, the most complete expression of Meyer Lansky's tragedy. Not the offshore accounts, or the Bugsy Siegel decision, or the FBI surveillance, or the Las Vegas prosecution. Those were professional setbacks, comprehensible within the logic of the professional life he had chosen. The Israel rejection was something else. It was the moment when the understanding that had been his greatest professional asset, the understanding of how systems work underneath their visible surfaces, became the thing that most clearly illuminated what he had lost. He understood exactly what had been done to him, and by whom, and why. And there was nothing he could build, or design, or finance, or manage to change it. He left Israel. He returned to Miami. He lived another 11 years, productive years, in which he continued to do what he had always done, which was to think carefully and act precisely and give nothing away. The Israel rejection was absorbed the way he absorbed everything, which was completely and invisibly and without public complaint. He never talked about it in the terms that would have made its full weight visible. He maintained the same composure, the same controlled surface, the same measured responses to careful questions that had characterized his public presence for 50 years. But his wife knew. The people who were closest to him knew. And the specific quality of his last decade, the Miami decade after Israel, was different from the decades before it in a way that his most careful observers have documented without always being able to articulate precisely what the difference was. What the difference was, the thing that was present in Israel and absent in Miami, Anne Lansky named it. She said it was hope. The hope of a man who thought, at 70, that there was still one place left where he could simply be himself. The hope that was taken from him by a Supreme Court ruling in November 1972. The hope that he did not find again. Meyer Lansky was buried in Miami Beach. He had wanted, in some form that was never fully articulated but that the people closest to him understood, to be buried in Israel. That did not happen either. The Jewish state that had rejected the living man also received the dead man only in the abstract. He is not there. He is in Miami, in the city where he lived his American life and from which he tried, once, to leave for somewhere that felt like home. The law of return is still in effect. It still says that every Jewish person has the right to come home. The irony is permanent. The decision is permanent. And Meyer Lansky, the man who organized resistance to American Nazi groups and funded the Israeli independence effort and contributed to Jewish causes for 6 decades, remains in Miami. Not in the country whose right he thought was his by birth and by commitment and by the plain language of its foundational law. The home that said, "Come," and then said, "Not you." The irony that the man who built an invisible empire spent his last 11 years carrying quietly, the way he carried everything, completely and without complaint, and without ever quite putting it down. There is one more thing worth saying about the Israel story, and it is the thing that most directly connects it to the rest of Meyer Lansky's life in a way that makes the whole story coherent rather than simply tragic. Meyer Lansky had spent 50 years building an architecture of invisibility. The offshore accounts, the nominee structures, the carefully maintained absence from every visible organizational chart. The discipline of giving the cameras nothing. The professional life entirely constructed around the principle that the safest position is the one with no visible surface. All of this was a response to the specific world he lived in. A world where being visible as what he was, Jewish, immigrant, operating outside the legal economy, made him vulnerable in specific and consequential ways. The invisibility was not chosen for its own sake. It was chosen as protection. In Israel, for 14 months, he had tried to lay that protection down, to be visible as what he was, to be seen as a Jewish man in the Jewish state without the overlay of everything else, to simply be. This is what the law of return promised, not just citizenship, the right to be what you were, unconditionally, in a place that was built for exactly that. The unconditional acceptance of what you fundamentally were. That was the promise. That was what those 14 months in Tel Aviv had briefly delivered. And that was what the Supreme Court ruling took. He went back to being invisible. It was the only safe position he had ever known. He went back to the apartment, and the restaurant, and the dog, and the measured responses to careful questions. He went back to giving nothing away. He was 70 years old, and he had tried once to give something. The thing he had given, his identity, his presence, his simple Jewishness in the Jewish homeland, had been returned to him as inadmissible. He took it back. He carried it the rest of his life in the same invisible way he had always carried it. And when he died in January 1983, it was buried with him in Miami, far from the place he had tried to call home. The Israel rejection is not a footnote in Meyer Lansky's story. It is the heart of it. The place where the man underneath the empire becomes fully visible for one moment before the closing shot of the same invisibility he had always occupied. It is the moment that makes everything else legible. The 50 years of invisibility were not just professional strategy. They were the survival mechanism of a man who knew, from his first years in America, that being seen as what he was carried consequences. Israel was the moment he decided, at 70, that the consequences no longer mattered, that he was willing to be seen, that he wanted to be home more than he needed to be safe. The consequences came anyway. The home said, "Not you." He accepted this and went back to Miami and lived 11 more years, exact and precise and giving nothing away, being exactly who he had always been, in exactly the way he had always had to be. Invisible, safe, far from home.